In the past, when we talked to customers, email communication was usually chosen. However, this often created a sense of mistrust, because if I write an email saying, hey, I've been hacked now.
The question is not if a company will be hit, but when. No company is too small. No company is too insignificant. No data is too unimportant. Simply because these attacks are deployed using a scattergun approach, it will eventually affect everyone. I can't say in a crisis, now is an inconvenient time and I'd like to just disappear for 2 weeks.
Stop with this fear-mongering nonsense. Because what happens when I'm afraid? I shrink into myself and say, I can't solve it right now anyway, so I'd rather do nothing at all.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear: security isn't negotiable, it's a top priority.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Cybersecurity Executive Matter, the podcast. Today with Janka. Hi, Janka.
Hey.
For those who don't know you yet, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
I'd be happy to. My name is Janka Kreißl. I am a partner at DUNKELBLAU. DUNKELBLAU specializes in crisis management and crisis communication. Crises of all kinds, actually. So we handle all types of potential reputational damage for organizations of all sizes and across all industries. But indeed, in the past few years, the topic of cyber has increased enormously. That's why we find ourselves dealing with a new cyber incident almost every week, where we assist with crisis management and crisis communication. Why can I do this? Or why do I believe I can do this? I originally studied journalism, worked for a long time in PR and advertising agencies, and also in corporate communications for several years. And also in technical documentation. And I also worked on a cruise ship for 3 years. And all of this, what I learned over these years, actually helps now with crisis management and crisis communication, because everything somehow comes together. So when journalists send long lists of questions, with questions and a deadline by tomorrow noon, then I roughly know how the story is supposed to look. But I also know what's happening simultaneously in corporate communications, what problems arise there and what questions are being asked, and can therefore hopefully always support our clients very well.
Today, we want to talk about the topic, crisis management. And you've already said that you are exactly the right person for crises. But before we start with that, maybe let's address the fundamental question, what exactly is a crisis? Because that's where it already starts a bit for me. Every client or everyone defines a different issue as a crisis, or everyone says, for me, that's not a crisis yet either. There's always the discussion, what is a crisis? What is an emergency? Maybe also for the audience, what is a crisis for you?
I would say there are two approaches to the topic. On one hand, there is, of course, the technical definition. So if you are in an organization where the BCM is already appropriately established, or at least the IT department has already defined for itself what is a disruption, what is an emergency, what is a crisis. So then there are these technical parameters by which I can determine what scenario I am currently in. There are evaluation questions and escalation levels, ideally, so that I know, okay, this is the situation I'm in and I need to convene the crisis team or the special organizational structure or not. The approach that is very important for us as crisis communicators is the question of stakeholders. So I will use the term more often today. Stakeholders are all types of interest groups that an organization or a company has. These can be internal, like employees, board members, or etc. Or also external, like customers, partners, suppliers, authorities, media, etc. And if even just a part of these stakeholders, these interest groups, feels that there is now a crisis, then the point is actually reached when the crisis begins. Perhaps very briefly on these expectations. So everyone always has some expectation of the company. Employees expect to be able to do their job properly, to be paid their salary on time, and for the company to adhere to certain values. Customers, of course, expect their product to be delivered on time and services to be provided, etc. And as long as these expectations are met, everything is fine. If there are problems in meeting these expectations, then these stakeholders reconsider their behavior and think, can I still tolerate this, or do I need to change my behavior now? For example, getting angry and writing emails, calling sales angrily, contacting the works council, etc. And this change from disappointed expectation to a pressure to act is the trigger for such a crisis. So where traditional communication or classic PR agencies essentially do expectation management, we do disappointment management. When we come on board, it's either already at that point or there's a threat that expectations will be disappointed. And then the stakeholders feel compelled or motivated to take action.
But do you think that you should only come in when the crisis has already happened? Or would you say it should actually happen as a change in mindset for us as well? That's something I've mentioned multiple times on the podcast and repeatedly. I advocate to companies that something like a cyber drill or an emergency drill should be just like a fire drill. Shouldn't that already be standard for every company?
I want to get the one sentence out of the way that you probably hear in every podcast, then we'll have it behind us. The question is not if a company will be hit, but when. And it is indeed true, you really can't emphasize it enough. No company is too small, no company is too insignificant, no data is too unimportant. Simply because these attacks are deployed using a scattergun approach, it will eventually affect everyone. So, therefore, of course, it's good if you have already dealt with this whole topic beforehand. Perhaps a brief digression. In 2019, we assisted our first client who was hacked. That was quite some time ago. And if you look at it from a communication science perspective, there are 3 types of crises. There is the victim crisis, the accident crisis, and the responsibility crisis. Victim crisis, the name already suggests it. To put it very simply, they can't do much about the fact that this crisis happens to them and can only do so much to end or address the crisis. Accident crisis? Perhaps measures were already taken, but they weren't sufficient. I don't know, the structure I built wasn't high enough. And the responsibility crisis is really on the other end of the scale. So the company is basically, they are primarily responsible for the crisis occurring and can and must handle it themselves. And in 2019, a ransomware attack was clearly still considered a victim crisis. Back then, it wasn't so well known, and one could still argue, well, even communicatively, well, we became victims there. We didn't know what was threatening us, what dangers cyberspace essentially brings with it. Whereas today it has clearly shifted towards a responsibility crisis precisely because the danger is widely known. I actually want to say is, but let's say should be, and one prepares for it. And if you sort of slip into this crisis, meaning I am being attacked, then that's the first type of crisis. That's still okay. People forgive that, but the real crisis arises when the feeling emerges that the company doesn't know what it's doing at all because it is not prepared for this scenario. So that is truly a classic responsibility crisis. And that is then perceived as organizational failure. Therefore, yes, you have to deal with it in advance during times when you have a clear head, more or less have time. I never know if anyone really has time to deal with things preventively. It costs resources, and then people have to step out of their daily work routine. Nevertheless, yes, of course, this preparation is necessary. And we also support that rather than in an acute case. But in fact, it is the case that 80%, the percent of calls that come into us on Friday afternoons are the ones where they say, we've been encrypted. We need immediate support now. Dear fire department, please come.
What is the difference for you between a crisis and an emergency?
I don't really like to evaluate it from a technical perspective because that's where the different definitions come from. I think for us, an emergency still feels like something where we say, or rather, the official definition is that the plans you have, they work or can be adjusted slightly. With a bit of juggling, we can manage it. In a crisis, nothing works. There are either no plans or the ones I have don't work. So that's the purely factual definition. But a crisis for me is when really, on one hand, and we actually experience this often, this headless chicken mode is activated and everyone suddenly either freezes or runs around completely agitated, trying to do everything at once. And when it is really, really bad, like when the existence of the company or organization is threatened, I think that's a classic crisis indicator.
Now, you've already mentioned an important part. I've also mentioned this frequently in the podcast, especially this headless chicken mode. I've seen it very often. You then arrive at a client. No one really knows what's going on. The employees who can no longer work, they all go home because they say, I can't work on the computer anymore. I'm doing home office, so to speak, because pen and paper are no longer known. But maybe from your experience, what are the classic phases that you go through with a client in a crisis? Where does it start and where should it ideally end?
Because I will probably forget, I'll start with the end. At the end, there should always be an evaluation of what went well and what went poorly. And it's not just me who actually forgets this. I think many companies that have really gone through this crisis think to themselves after days, weeks, or even months, thank God, finally back to normal, working, sleeping, and having a private and social life. And then I believe the last thing you want to do is sit down again and look at what went well and what went poorly. It actually has to be done so that it goes better next time. And now back to the beginning. What do we do first? When we get into such a case, we naturally have a checklist that we go through where we look closely which areas are actually affected. Can I still offer my services and products? Yes, no. And if yes, to what extent? Yes or no. How long is it expected to last? That's basically the whole technical part. At the same time, I naturally have to first check if the people sitting together are also the ones who can assess it. Or are important roles missing? Are important contacts missing? So maybe not in the first half of the day, but at least for the further course, all the people I need are accessible. And not just an extension or a central number of some law firm or agency, but really the direct extension where I can reach someone even on a Sunday morning at 10. And then it simply comes down to checking, okay, which work streams do I actually have now? So who needs to do what? Is that clear to everyone? If not, I need to onboard them very quickly and make it clear what is now required of them. And then it actually goes through these different phases, which can vary depending on the course of the attack and the recovery. A brief aside on that. As I said, we handle all types of crises in the cyber crisis. Or rather, in most cases, it's a ransomware attack, which can be really, really well prepared for because the course is often so similar or at least alike. There are very few deviations. Are the backups encrypted? Yes, no. Do I enter negotiations? Can I buy time? Do I even pay ransom? We might come back to that later. But in principle, the process is always the same, whereas with other crises like compliance violations or restructuring or whatever it is today, you really don't know what will happen tomorrow. And that's also why it's easy or relatively easy to prepare for it. So please, one should also do it.
You're addressing an important point for me right now. You just mentioned the topic of preparation, but also the topic of communication. What I often see about in a crisis is also that, as you said at the beginning, the various stakeholders don't really know their roles, or not at all. They don't know these dependencies. There's a simple example. That, for instance, the management approaches the IT during an attack and says, now you have to step up, now you have to do this, you have to do that, which technically doesn't work or can't be accelerated technically. Do you also often see in your cases that the stakeholders are not really in their roles and don't understand how some dependencies work, and that it doesn't make sense to exert pressure on someone because they can't work any faster?
So with the internal stakeholders, definitely. The impression I have, or that we have gained from our practice, is that IT is often well prepared for the topic and knows exactly what trouble is looming and perhaps has already tried to present it to management, but keeps hitting boundaries and then after 2 or 3 years says, I've said it 3 times now. But if no one wants to listen to me, then I just give up. So basically this one bubble, the IT bubble, is well prepared, but there are no interfaces to the other colleagues or teams. And in the crisis team, there must, of course, also be management present who must make strategic decisions. For example, do we make contact or do we pay ransom? The legal side must be considered. It must be clear what reporting deadlines and obligations we are subject to. And how can we fulfill them? The communications department must be at the table so that they know, what do I prepare internally and externally? What is my strategic stance, my communicative approach, and how do I implement it? And it really helps if you've done it before. That's why when we conduct such workshops. On the topic of crisis preparation, we bring all the people together at one table, and some already know each other and can work together, and some have only seen each other once at a Christmas party and never again. and to generally create an understanding of how one should collaborate. That is already very valuable so that everyone knows, okay, the different perspectives, as you also say, of course, everyone first looks at IT and says, please save us. But it's not that simple. And that's why other teams also need to be involved in making decisions, supporting them and implementing them.
And you just mentioned an important point for me, which I often unfortunately miss, especially this public communication, also through another channel. I mean, you yourself also mentioned at the beginning where you come from. In many companies, I see that this communication is conducted very technically, which is certainly due to the fact that the person who did it also comes from a technical background. But we also always have to consider, what is the target audience of my communication? Who do I want to reach with it? And what is the right medium for this target audience? And I often see that then either there is no communication at all, too much communication, or it is communicated too technically. What is your experience? What would you advise a company that is currently facing this challenge? Are you more a fan of communicating more or less?
I see two questions or two issues there. One is actually, do I make it public? And if so, when? So then if I have a lot of information or all of it, it takes forever. So there isn't really a classic recommendation or rule of thumb. But what you always have to keep in mind is that it will become public anyway, simply because the attackers will also publish it on a list. So at some point it will become public, and then I can and should get ahead of it and tell my important customers and key partners, folks, we have a problem. This is the situation. We are looking into it. If we delve a bit deeper into the topic again, also how to do it, but mainly first, yes, it should be done in most cases. And then yes, the question is, what do I say? So in these crisis teams, depending on how big the case is, there are also different crisis teams. There might be the technical one with the internal IT and the external, supporters from incident response and forensics. And they will probably send a representative to the main crisis team where it's about organizational matters. And even there, if you meet for the first time and hear about this topic for the first time as someone who has never dealt with it before, then I probably won't understand much in many areas. So I should have a basic understanding, even as someone responsible for communications, how such attacks proceed. And what that means, because what ET brings in as input is technical and can sound very much like a foreign language. So it needs someone who can translate this foreign language. And by that, I also mean the names or designations of IT systems, specialized procedures, and programs and services. So the IT says system A and B are running again, or specialized procedures 1 and 2 are operational again. And I have to basically translate it into what does it mean? Because for citizens, for my customers, so for all these people who expect something from me, we're back to these expectations. They actually just want to know, like everyone in such a case, well, when can I do my job again? When can I do everything as I'm used to again? And this translation effort is important, and it actually takes time. If you are not well versed in the topic and your own systems, you first have to learn in the crisis, okay, the IT says this and that, the system area is necessary for that. Okay, then I have to transfer. Basically what that means. Yes, and that is also much exhausting as someone responsible for communication. You don't make yourself popular if you ask 5 times in the crisis team, what exactly does that mean? So on one hand, what does that mean content-wise? And I believe all the crisis teams we have visited during cyber incidents will remember that we always ask about schedules. So, okay, what is the schedule? We know we can't say anything yet. We don't know yet when it will happen, but we need to offer a perspective. So this, what we call pessimistic process communication, I need to establish that. And for that, I really need information.
Now, you've already touched on a topic, namely how communication is done and especially where communication takes place. Let's delve a bit deeper into that because I also see changes there. In the past, when we talked to customers, email communication was usually chosen. So customers were addressed via distribution lists. However, this often created a sense of mistrust because if I write an email saying, hey, I've been hacked now, and by the way, we don't really know what exactly happened yet. And if another customer sees that, there were cases where it spread further through email. In other words, the virus, the ransomware, or whatever was on the computer naturally tried to evolve and infect other systems as well. And so, of course, if you already have the information that you've been hacked, you definitely don't want to open an email from the other party. So that was always a bit of a problem when communicating. Well, an email from the person who has been hacked, I really don't want to open that either. Nowadays, I often see that social media is also being used for such things. So many companies are also very quick to use social media. I've often seen things on LinkedIn, I've seen things on Facebook, I've seen things on X. What is your experience like? Do you think that these social media platforms, regardless of which one you consider, can lead to more people being reached and information being shared more quickly? Or do you also think that it's always a question of which target audience should be behind it?
First of all, congratulations to the companies that still have distribution lists. Often the case is that you have a system where all the addresses are stored, but it's currently not accessible. So the question we ask first, or one of the first questions, is who will be the most upset? And how bad is it for the company? It could also be, which customer group is affected? Is it everyone or just 80%? And of the 80%, who is most severely affected and who will be the most upset? And does it really harm me? Or can I perhaps deduct another 20%? I can answer these questions, but I still can't split my communication because I can't determine who should receive which information. And on the topic of channels, or rather on the topic of communication. In general, the question is always who tells whom, what, on which channel, and when. Channels, as you just mentioned, are also difficult if I don't have backup email addresses that I can use. And where the customer also says, yes, okay, this is coming from company XY and not from some phishing account or for phishing purposes. So I have to look closely at what is possible. And often it is indeed the case that we have to say, dear sales team, dear customer management, you just call the most important people because we currently have no other options. We might be able to follow up later via email or however by letter. If email is no longer possible, that I have to make the data protection notification by letter. We've had that situation before as well. But to see how I can reach people the fastest. And it is indeed the case that our recommendation always goes in that direction. Just as I normally communicate with people in everyday business, I can and should continue to do so. So if I am someone who somehow posts every day on whatever, TikTok, Instagram, or LinkedIn, I can of course try in an emergency to use this channel to multiply my message. But I also have to be aware that something will come back. So I can't just send, but something will also come back. And I have to decide in this situation whether I can handle it, whether I can manage it, or if I say, well, let's leave LinkedIn for now and really contact those who are most affected or concerned and keep the feedback channel open there as well, but can consolidate it better. So there isn't a golden rule here either. You just always have to see how the company usually communicates. Also, what values has it committed to? So if I have being bold, innovative, and transparent as a company value or brand core, then I can't say in a crisis, now is an inconvenient time and I'd like to just disappear for 2 weeks. So everything has to fit together, of course. That's why it's always important to approach the whole thing with a bit of sensitivity.
How do you now view communication with the press? That too has changed significantly for me over the years, because there is a completely different interest in these topics now. Before, cyber was like, okay, we have something like that, a niche topic. These days, it seems like you read about cyber attacks, ransomware, and haven't you seen it? There are also many people who share it on LinkedIn and so on. So there's a completely different level of interest now. Has this also have a place in your work, especially in your work, to collaborate more and more with the press?
On one hand, I think it's really good that the topic is increasingly being covered in the press. And not just at Golem or Heiser, that is in specialized or industry media, but more and more broadly, because my hope is that it will also create more awareness and people really realize that it's not just something from a crazy movie or something that only concerns the big players, but it's something that can also affect the Mueller Carpentry or any SMEs. That's one aspect. And we have actually already experienced that local journalists have inquired on the second day of the crisis, like, oh, we heard something, we would like to write a report from the crisis team, which I totally understand. I also worked in journalism. It's a great story, especially if it's a smaller place, but the market leader or hidden champion is based there. On the other hand, you can't afford that. And it's also the wrong time, of which I'm convinced that it's good to say once you've managed the whole thing. And now I stand up and say, also as a role model in my business network circles, wherever I stand up and say, we were hit by this. We did that. We were prepared for it. We had to make adjustments. Please consider that it can also happen to you. So I think that's good. We have actually also acted as press for some clients we have supported or organizations, because especially with SMEs, there is often no explicit communication department, or let alone a press officer who is used to it. So sometimes it might do that. The managing director or directors themselves stand in front of the camera, but even for that, you need speaking notes. I have to provide the content. What do I say? At what time? And I am definitely in favor of dealing transparently with the press or with such inquiries, because it will come out anyway. So then maybe an employee or a customer says, guys, I feel so poorly informed right now. I'll just handle this through the public. But of course, you have to see what the company can actually do in this situation. What can be achieved, or what is a better time? You can also engage in background discussions, explaining to local journalists what the current situation is and that no one really has the headspace for it. But maybe in a week or two, they would be willing to do an interview.
I think you're touching on an important point there, especially the topic of learning from mistakes and sharing these lessons learned with others. That's exactly what we need to do in cybersecurity. It's also one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast, because I keep saying that we actually need to talk more with each other on all levels to support each other, to perhaps protect each other as well. But of course, I can also understand the people who might not want to admit it or don't want to look too deeply into it. But that's a bit of this chicken and egg problem, as I often say. You can't protect someone like others if you don't know. What I find nice, however, and this has changed in recent years, is that there have been some great cases that have done lessons learned, where they have been truly honest, saying where things didn't go well or where they did, and have thus brought people along. And that brings me to the next reason, because you actually said at the beginning, you must not forget to draw lessons learned from it and see how to deal with it. What I often experience again is once you've gone through this crisis, you feel like you've brought everything back to normal for the time being, but you haven't actually found the real problem, or let's say the host, why it happened if we were to speak in another language. And then 2 weeks later, you have exactly the same thing again in green because the same group attacked you again. Or perhaps another group that exploited exactly the same vulnerability again. And then it starts all over again. That means after communication, the topic of lessons learned is also super important. With your clients or also in your projects, is that still a topic where you have to fight a lot to ensure that lessons learned happens, because you have to take people out of their daily routine a bit, right? They have just returned to their routine and now need to be taken out again to simply talk about lessons learned and also to see what can be done differently. Or has the awareness, I love the word awareness, has the awareness improved so that people also understand that no, lessons learned is actually super important? And before we, let's say, pop the corks, we should first deal with the lessons learned.
We are kind of like the fire brigade, and we go in once the worst has been fixed. That means we are often no longer there at the point when the lessons learned could or must take place. What we have indeed noticed is that companies then say, people, I just take the day of the hack, essentially the attack. I now take this as an occasion every year to hold a cybersecurity day where I conduct employee training again, and perhaps also pat each other on the back for how well we got through it, if that was the case. So simply saying, I won't let this topic fade away and pretend it never happened, but I need to maintain it to keep awareness high. And I said, I understand everyone who then says, no, please, really, now leave me alone with the crisis. I need to dive into my week first. Or my daily business has piled up. I can't keep up with working through it at all. Let's do it in a month or 2 or 3. That's also possible. And ultimately every company can manage it in the way they believe they can handle it. But I think it's important to look at all the processes. So did the notification chain really work? Did the escalation levels fit? Or do I need to tighten something? Was the information given too early or too late internally? Was the crisis team too large? These are also things. So maybe in the end, it turns out we need leaner processes. Fine. So then that's also a realization. Or the communication officers who then say, people, now we have such good templates, we'll just leave them in the drawer. Maybe one of our subsidiaries will find itself in the same situation. Then we already have it ready. Or also the contacts that arise during such a crisis. Not just letting them get lost in some email threads, but saying, I'll make, an Excel spreadsheet or whatever CRM tool, or a paper list, because if there's a hack, Excel might be gone, perhaps. So I'll just make this list with my emergency contacts and keep it up to date. It's no use to me if I have one from 3 years ago and then try to reach someone who is no longer in the market or the colleague is no longer there.
In your opinion, what is something you should absolutely not do in a crisis?
Forget to eat. So everyone who has experienced a crisis with me knows that I am a big fan of food, which always sounds a bit strange at first. But indeed, the point will come where you say you can't just live on pizza and energy drinks anymore, but you have to really look at how to keep people motivated in the long run, which is the topic. So I believe in a crisis, one must not forget that everyone sitting there are people, including the attackers, by the way. They probably also have certain service hours during which they are reachable and not. They have a patience threshold that can snap. And then they say, I've watched for 2 weeks now we're going to publish the data. I don't care how you would have wanted to continue negotiating. But of course, also in this company, people will reach their limits. There will be people who, will be more irritable than usual, not as friendly, because they are simply under very, very high pressure, under high stress. You have to anticipate that. You have to take care of it. We have also handled cases where we set up rooms where people could just sit for 15 or 20 minutes and stare into space, where no one was allowed to ask them anything, where there were no phones, where you just sit and take a breather. Or what is always good is if there is a dog in the crisis team, because then you actually get out, you have to go outside and spend 10 minutes with the animal. Also, it always brings good feelings, and unless you don't like dogs or are allergic. But also in a way, considering that normal life also continues. So on one hand, of course, the workday continues, but also private life. Also, people have children who need to be picked up from sports. People have spouses. And spouses don't find it cool when you completely lose it after 2 weeks because you haven't eaten or slept. So also consider this and keep addressing it. In a way, also consider this in communication and say, we see what you are accomplishing. So it's not a given, and let's all work together, please. Also towards the customers so that we get through this well. These were more like soft facts, but I believe these are the ones that are sometimes actually forgotten, even when you prepare. Then you think, well, I have plans now and I've simulated everything once and it worked well, so the crisis can come. But something will always go wrong. Something will always develop differently than you expect.
Yes, and I would like to advocate for this topic again. You already mentioned it, but I also see this often in a crisis. Appreciation is a super important topic. So, as you already said, these are all people sitting here. Out of the conviction, we want to help the company, we want to work on the issue together. And you brought up the example of pizza. I can tell you about cases where I eventually stood up to the CEO and said, this is where it stops when it came to organizing meals, for example. There was a statement like, no, you have to do it yourself. Or, overtime here is not paid. And all such stories. And I always have to say, the people, they don't necessarily want to be paid for overtime. They don't want a pizza given to them, but they want some form of appreciation. They want to feel that, aha, I am here now. They don't want applause or anything else or to be pampered. But such appreciation, that is the most important thing for me, because whether it's a crisis or not, you see that time, and again nowadays, so much is taken for granted, assumed as standard, that it's naturally expected for you to do it. But no, that's not a standard. People sacrifice their time. I've also had many crisis management teams where you sat for 2 weeks straight, 24/7, doing nothing else. Your private life goes down the drain. On the side, everything goes down the drain on the side, and just a simple, thank you for doing this. or some appreciation, but whether it's a pizza given out or whatever, it doesn't hurt much, but it shows enormous appreciation to the people. And unfortunately, I've experienced more often that this didn't happen, because it's more like the IT has to handle that now. Or so-and-so has to handle it because it's their job. No, a crisis is not their job. As the word crisis suggests, it's an exceptional situation. There's no job description for that unless you work for companies that do crisis management. For them, let's say, they have already taken it on with the soft designation, more or less. But now in the company, it's just not a standard. And I can clearly say that appreciation is the be-all and end-all, because then you will also see how well a crisis can be managed.
That is indeed something that good crisis communication can and must achieve, also towards the customers. When I tell the customers, clearly and transparently, there is this and that problem, we were prepared in such and such a way, and now we are doing this and that correctly, then I can maintain goodwill there for a long time, and I need that. I don't want the customers to immediately say, great, compensation for non-performance. Or our IT would now like to know from your IT what exactly went wrong. I really have to act on a human level through good communication. And what I absolutely can't stand is this blame game. So on the one hand, it will eventually become clear, based on the forensic investigation, what was the IOC, how did it happen, what was the one trigger. And I really advocate keeping the circle of people who know this as small as possible. It doesn't help anyone if you say, Ms. Main from accounting clicked on this phishing email on the link. And also not to look at IT and say, well, you just recently got more budget. How could this happen? That's the internal aspect, so to speak. But also where I really become passionate is when I follow on LinkedIn, look, the next ones have been hit. And how stupid can one still be today? I really can't stand that, because it sometimes feels a bit like kicking someone when they're down and not like a genuine interest in the matter to find out how it really happened and how one can truly set up technically. This can be solved differently than through social media platforms.
Yes, and you're speaking from my heart, because that's exactly what I say too. Stop with this fear-mongering nonsense. Because what happens when I'm afraid? I shrink into myself and say, I can't solve it right now anyway, so I'd rather do nothing at all. So, fear actually prevents exactly what we want to achieve. And I'm with you. This endless blaming, this one is affected, that one is affected, how could that have happened? We are all just human. Humans make mistakes, and no matter what happens, it's first about figuring out how this company can return to normal operations, to potentially make everything productive again, or I would say to secure the jobs again. The same goes for me with the discussion about paying ransom, yes or no. 2 years ago, I had someone on the podcast who was known for negotiating ransom payments together with insurance companies or being involved in that. There was a huge backlash in the comments about how one could show that because you're not supposed to show it, as it lets the perpetrators get away with it and so on and so forth. And back then I also said, folks, the only person who has the right to say anything here is the CEO, the executives of the company, who must bear this responsibility. They have to take responsibility for 300, 400, 500 people, 1,000 people. And if this responsibility is simply, watch out, a restoration would take 3 weeks, would cost me such and such a loss, maybe drive me into insolvency, regardless of whether the damn security measures were taken or not. That doesn't count at this point. It only matters. It could lead to people possibly losing their jobs. It could lead to the company going bankrupt. Yes, why not? Then someone must also consider this other way. Because even insurance companies sometimes prefer to pay the money rather than, let's say, invest in measures. Because they say you'll be back on your feet faster this way than if you try to do extensive forensics and this and that. That is more cost effective for us. Then this option should also be open for discussion. And I think it's wrong to simply say from the outset, yes, by doing this, I am supporting people. There is crime everywhere. You always support crime in some way when you engage with it. But the point is, you always have to look back to see if it's the right path for my own company right now and if it works for me. And I clearly defended that back then because I said no one else should decide that. Everyone sitting here now is not in that position. If this were my company and I had to make this decision, I would decide the same way. Because I have a responsibility for my employees. And if I tell them now, folks, I'm not paying any ransom, and a restoration will take 4 weeks, 5 weeks, or whatever. And because of that, I have to file for bankruptcy. Goodbye. What kind of path is that?
We also often say in such preparatory workshops, develop a basic attitude towards it. And of course, the authorities recommend not paying, and most will naturally also say, we will not be blackmailed. But as you rightly say, I believe this moral stance can quickly falter when you're really under pressure. And then to decide wisely and strategically and to say, yes, if that's the last option, then so be it. We have also accompanied this before. We have also assisted clients who have paid. Then it is simply important that you also have lawyers by your side, for example, who can justify it legally with an emergency statement, essentially creating a mini expert report. And of course, you also try to negotiate the sum down with good negotiators. But if I have this network and these contacts, and it is really the only way, well, then, as you say, ultimately, it is the decision of the person who has the responsibility. Not only for on one hand, for the employees, and of course, also for the customers. And what we are increasingly observing, especially recently, is this kind of package payment where you pay, amount X for the decryption key, another amount X for the attackers to explain how they got in, and another amount X for the deletion of data and non-publication on the dark web. So you can also consider, okay, if I now say I don't want to rebuild one-to-one, I'll skip the decryption key, we can manage well enough, and the backups are not affected, fine. But I also don't want the secret recipes or construction plans of my customers or even just the ID cards of my employees to appear on the dark web, then I might pay this amount. And yes, you are supporting crime or the financing of terrorist organizations. Everything must be considered, but I completely agree with you. There are simply situations and no one from the outside can presume to decide where there might be no other option left.
Yes, and what I always find so important there, as you just mentioned, the counterpart, the attackers, they have also become much more professional. There are even dedicated customer managers who take care of you directly. Hey, how are you? What can we do for you? Oh, the amount is too high. Do they have a certain leeway? If you exceed this leeway, they say, I need to talk to my boss about it. How does it look? So there's a lot possible there as well. And also compared to before, when there were really many cases where people paid and still didn't get decrypted, it's a completely different story nowadays. The companies, I'll really call them companies on the other side, they don't want to lose their trust either. Because it would be bad for them if it suddenly came out. We hacked company XY, gave them the key, and it didn't work. So I have to say clearly a huge thing has developed there. Or it has also, I would say, developed in favor of the victims, as many are very careful about their reputations. You sometimes even get parts of the recovery key for free, so you can test if it's the right one, if it works, and so on and so forth. Or what I've also experienced is that the recovery key didn't work. Then, so to speak, the attacker accessed the computer via remote maintenance and checked why the recovery key wasn't working. So you can also see that previously, paying was often just, I would say, a scam. Now, paying is really, I don't want to say a guarantee because there are still cases where it doesn't work, but it is often the case where you actually get decryption and your data is not published because they have also realized on the other side that it affects their own reputation. It helps if I deal honestly with people, and handle it differently rather than just saying, I'll take all the money I can get. And in the end, I stopped doing that. Yes, I agree with you. If we look back again, because this is such an exciting topic for me, we talked about what non-crisis communication is. We talked roughly about a crisis plan. We talked about lessons learned. What are your 3 most important tips in crisis management that you have repeatedly seen from your experience, which should be noted regardless of all the phases we discussed?
Firstly, actually consider it in advance and write down the result of this thinking with all involved parties. And please, anyone is welcome to write 60-page manuals, go ahead. But they need to be supplemented with short checklists, with questions for situation assessment, with really lists where I can check things off. I bring it to the next meeting again. I go through the whole process again. So practical things that people are familiar with. Please do not use tools that are only kept for the crisis. They will not work and they will not be used in the crisis either. I can create super great communication channels, but if in the end everyone is still using WhatsApp or Signal, I've spent money for nothing. So that's one thing. Really, think pragmatically, even in the preparation phase. The second is to stay true to your basic attitude, as I already mentioned. So really not disappearing off the face of the earth and doing nothing at all, but also not promising too much. So it's no use if suddenly someone at the reception where the call comes out or with the customer says, no, I think we can fix it by tomorrow. So that's also difficult. So this balance between what do I say, which forecasts do I give, but which promises might I also not be able to keep, and therefore should not make them. That's the second thing. And the third is, I think, really to look at who is specifically affected in this scenario. And have I perhaps forgotten someone? Did I say in the first few hours, well, come on, I don't know, with the partners, they don't need anything immediately. I'll write to them on Friday, then it's Friday. And because no one logs things, by the way, this is also a very important aspect in the crisis team. Everything must always be recorded and logged. This is also a very thankless job, but it has to be done. So, and then I might forget something. Or, well, of course, I know I have to report to the LDI within 72 hours, but no one wrote it down and no one brings it up again. And then the 72 hours are up. Or I have to make a follow-up report because suddenly it becomes clear, okay, it's actually a different type of data, so I can set new criteria and provide new information, basically keeping these things in mind and checking repeatedly, who are my stakeholders? Are they still the same as 2 days ago? Have any dropped out? Have new ones been added? And do I still have all of them in view as the situation requires? I think that's the third takeaway.
Thank you for your great insights. Perhaps the last question. What would you, if someone from the audience listened to the podcast today and thinks tomorrow, now I have to deal with the topic of crisis management, besides contacting you, little disclaimer, maybe still, what would you recommend to them? What would be, so to speak, the first step to generally engage with the topic of crisis management?
I think the BSI's website is a good starting point if I really have nothing at all to initially inform myself about the topic. There are also templates for crisis manuals there. There are also links to further materials. They are partly very extensive, and then you might get a bit panicked. Like, how am I supposed to manage that? I might as well give up. The advice would be, no, please don't give up. Even a slim version is better than no version at all. And everything I have filed away in a crisis in the drawer or in my main folder, which serves as a framework where I can navigate through, is better than nothing. So definitely get started. Even 80%, 60%, and even 40% are better than 0% preparation.
You're speaking from my heart, because that applies not only to crises, but to cybersecurity in general. You don't always need 80%, sometimes 10 or 20% is enough to get started. Thank you, Janka, for the great exchange and especially for the insight into your job. I hope, of course, even though it's often the case for you, that you are involved in many crises, that you don't always have to eat pizza and junk food. So maybe next time, also the delicious broth perhaps. First of all, thank you very much for that. I think we were able to learn a lot about crisis management today and gained many insights. And with that, I would say that's it for this podcast. Cybersecurity, executive matter, and we'll hear and see each other next time. Until then.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.